Isaac Newton was born in 1642 in the quiet rural village of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, England, a fragile infant arriving prematurely during a time when the country was torn by civil unrest and uncertainty. His father had died only months before his birth, leaving his mother to manage the farm and the household alone. When Newton was still a small child, his mother remarried and moved away with her new husband, leaving young Isaac in the care of his maternal grandmother. This early separation left an enduring mark on his personality. He became introspective and withdrawn, preferring solitude to the company of others, and often sought comfort in the world of his imagination. As a boy, he was small, quiet, and often overlooked by his peers, not considered particularly promising. Yet beneath his reserved exterior lay a mind of restless curiosity. He spent long hours observing the natural world, studying the movement of the wind through the trees, the path of shadows across the ground, and the workings of simple household objects. He constructed small windmills powered by mice, miniature water wheels, and sundials marked on the walls of his home. These early experiments were not guided by formal instruction, but by a deep inner compulsion to understand how things worked. When he entered the local grammar school in Grantham, Newton initially struggled to keep pace with the other students. He was not quick to master rote memorization or recitation, and he remained shy and hesitant. However, a pivotal moment came when he found himself mocked by a classmate, which awakened in him a fierce determination to excel. From that point forward, he applied himself with relentless diligence. He rose steadily through the ranks of his class, devouring every book he could find. His interests extended far beyond the assigned curriculum. He read about mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Newton lodged with an apothecary's family while attending school, and this arrangement exposed him to the world of practical tools, chemicals, and mechanical devices. He became fascinated with the workings of gears, levers, and pulleys, and often spent his free hours constructing elaborate contraptions. He made kites and experimented with the shapes of their tails to see how they affected flight. He carved sundials that could accurately tell the time, and created miniature models of windmills that actually turned in the breeze. His mind was constantly searching for hidden patterns and principles behind the everyday phenomena that surrounded him. Despite his growing intellectual reputation at school, Newton remained socially isolated. He spoke little and was often lost in thought, scribbling in notebooks filled with sketches, calculations, and strange symbols. This inward focus made him seem peculiar to his classmates, but his teachers began to recognize his extraordinary potential. When his mother's second husband died, she returned to Woolsthorpe and attempted to pull Newton out of school so he could manage the family farm. Newton showed no talent or interest in agriculture, spending his time reading under hedgerows or carving figures on wooden gates instead of tending the fields. Seeing his unsuitability for farm life, one of his teachers convinced his mother to allow him to return to school and continue his studies. Freed from the burden of farm work, Newton threw himself entirely into his education. He began producing more complex mathematical calculations, experimenting with optics using bits of glass and mirrors, and carefully recording weather patterns. His notebooks from this period revealed the early glimmers of the systematic thinking that would later define his scientific method. He was not content merely to observe, he sought to understand, to find rules behind appearances. By the time he completed his schooling, Newton's reputation as an unusually gifted student had reached beyond Grantham. His intellectual progress persuaded his family and patrons that he should pursue further education. In 1661, he was admitted to Trinity College at Cambridge University. The transition from the quiet countryside to one of England's most prestigious centers of learning marked a turning point in his life. At Cambridge, he encountered the revolutionary ideas of thinkers like René Descartes, Johannes Kepler, and Galileo Galilei, whose writings were reshaping the intellectual world. Although the university curriculum was still rooted in classical scholasticism, Newton read voraciously outside the prescribed texts, seeking out modern works on mathematics and natural philosophy. He copied entire books by hand, dissected their arguments, and filled the margins with his own questions and theories. His mind absorbed the new knowledge with remarkable speed, building intricate mental structures from scattered fragments of thought. The quiet, withdrawn boy from Woolsthorpe had begun to transform into a mind capable of reshaping humanity's understanding of nature. Even in his earliest years, the qualities that would define Newton's life were already present: relentless curiosity, obsessive dedication, and a willingness to labor alone in pursuit of hidden truths. The hardships of his childhood had taught him self-reliance, and the isolation that once seemed a burden had become his greatest strength. In the shadowed rooms of his youth and the dusty halls of his first schools, the foundations were laid for one of the most extraordinary intellectual journeys in history. At Cambridge, Newton immersed himself in the study of mathematics, astronomy, optics, and natural philosophy with relentless dedication. His days unfolded with mechanical regularity, hours bent over worn pages, nights illuminated by the soft glow of a single candle as he traced equations and geometrical figures across scraps of parchment. The noise of student life receded from his world. He sought neither companionship nor diversion. Solitude became his chosen companion, a quiet space where his thoughts could spiral outward without interruption. He walked the college courtyards with his head bowed, not from shyness but from absorption, as if every stone underfoot concealed some principle awaiting discovery. His curiosity had no boundaries, and his hunger for knowledge carried a sharp edge of urgency. He devoured the works of ancient philosophers and contemporary thinkers alike, moving from Euclid's axioms to Descartes' analytical geometry, from Kepler's celestial laws to Galileo's mechanics. Yet he was never content to merely learn what others had concluded. Every theorem was to him an unfinished question, every experiment a starting point rather than an end point. He carried notebooks filled with dense, tiny handwriting where ideas bled into each other like threads in an intricate tapestry. He sought not facts alone, but the hidden patterns that bound them together, convinced that beneath the apparent chaos of nature lay a harmony governed by laws still undiscovered. Then the rhythm of his scholarly life was abruptly disrupted. The Great Plague swept through England, and Cambridge closed its doors. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, his childhood home, expecting perhaps to wait idly until the danger passed. Instead, isolation unleashed his full creative force. Deprived of lectures and the guidance of tutors, he became his own instructor, constructing a personal curriculum that reached beyond the boundaries of known knowledge. He set up a small laboratory in his room, cluttered with prisms, lenses, mirrors, and makeshift measuring tools fashioned from scraps of wood and metal. Outside, the world was gripped by fear and death. Inside, his world expanded at a staggering pace. It was during this period that he laid the foundations of calculus. He pursued the idea of change and motion not as abstract curiosities, but as the language through which the universe expressed itself. He filled page after page with flowing calculations, chasing infinitesimals through endless series and discovering rules to manipulate the infinitely small. It was a silent revolution, born not in lecture halls but in the stillness of rural seclusion. Simultaneously, he turned to the mysteries of light. He darkened his room and let a narrow beam of sunlight pass through a prism, watching as it spread into a ribbon of colors. The revelation struck him with quiet force. White light was not pure, but composed of many hues. He repeated the experiment obsessively, varying angles and materials until he was certain. In his mind, he began to dismantle centuries of accepted thought about light and vision. Yet the most audacious of his thoughts reached even farther. As he watched apples fall in the orchard and the moon hang suspended in the night sky, he began to wonder if the same unseen force guided both. Could there be a universal power binding the heavens and the earth together? He traced the arc of planetary motion with a trembling sense of possibility, sensing that some hidden thread connected all matter. These ideas remained unspoken, fragile and incomplete, but they burned within him like secret embers, urging him forward. During those 2 years of enforced solitude, the shape of his mind transformed. He was no longer merely a student absorbing the knowledge of others. He had become a solitary architect, sketching the blueprint of a new universe. The quiet fields of Woolsthorpe became a crucible for ideas that would someday redefine humanity's understanding of nature. While the world feared the plague outside, he built a private cosmos inside his mind, a world ruled not by chance or chaos, but by discoverable laws. And though no one yet knew his name beyond the halls of Cambridge, the mind that would one day alter the course of science had already taken its definitive form. When Newton returned to Cambridge after the long solitude of his years in Woolsthorpe, he carried with him a mind reshaped by discovery and sharpened by isolation. The quiet, withdrawn student who had once walked the college courtyards in obscurity began to emerge as a figure of formidable intellect. He accepted a fellowship at Trinity College and soon became a lecturer, though the act of speaking before others did not come naturally to him. His voice was low, his manner reserved, and many students found his delivery difficult to follow. Yet behind his measured words lay a storm of ideas. He approached teaching not as a performance, but as a continuation of his inner investigations, filling his lectures with dense layers of mathematics and natural philosophy that few could fully grasp. He did not seek admiration from his pupils. He sought only clarity in his own understanding, using the lecture hall as another kind of laboratory where he tested the architecture of his thoughts. It was during these years that he brought into public view the experiments he had once conducted in solitude. His studies in optics emerged first. He presented to the Royal Society his theory that white light was composed of all the colors of the spectrum, a claim that overturned centuries of belief. He demonstrated it with prisms and carefully arranged beams of light, showing how colors could be separated and then recombined into white. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some were astonished, others skeptical, and among the skeptics was Robert Hooke, one of the most prominent members of the Royal Society. Hooke challenged Newton's conclusions sharply, insisting that light behaved as a wave rather than as particles. Their dispute grew bitter, carried out in letters and papers that crackled with hostility beneath the formal language of science. Newton, intensely sensitive to criticism, felt wounded and increasingly retreated into himself. Yet even as the controversy darkened his spirit, it did not halt his work. He began to shift his attention from light to the deeper, more universal problem of motion. The laws governing falling bodies, the movements of planets, and the invisible forces that seemed to bind the cosmos together had long haunted his thoughts. He gathered scattered notes from his earlier years and began to forge them into a coherent framework. His approach was both audacious and meticulous. He treated the motions of the heavens not as mysteries but as problems of geometry and calculation. With a mind honed on the discipline of mathematics, he sought the simple principles from which the vast complexity of the universe might flow. By the mid-1680s, the urgency of this task consumed him completely. He withdrew almost entirely from social life, neglecting correspondence and rarely leaving his rooms. Visitors described him as pale, thin, and silent, yet his notebooks filled with intricate diagrams and lines of equations that seemed to march endlessly across the page. He wrestled with the concept of a force that acted at a distance, pulling planets in their orbits and drawing falling apples to the ground. This invisible thread, he concluded, must operate with the same rule everywhere, diminishing with the square of the distance, binding every particle of matter to every other. It was a breathtaking idea, yet he pursued it not with grandeur, but with a relentless, cold logic, testing every consequence until nothing remained uncertain. In 1687, after years of solitary labor, he released the culmination of his thought to the world.
The book bore the austere title Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. It was a work of staggering ambition and clarity. Within its dense Latin pages, he set forth 3 laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation, weaving them into a single, seamless system. He showed how the same laws that governed a falling stone also governed the orbits of planets and the path of comets. The heavens and the earth were no longer separate realms. They were part of one vast mechanism, governed by immutable principles. The cosmos itself became a kind of clockwork, intricate yet comprehensible, its motions describable in the language of mathematics. The publication of the Principia marked a turning point not only in Newton's life but in the history of human thought. Scholars across Europe recognized its brilliance almost at once. The book demanded immense effort to understand, yet those who could pierce its dense arguments saw the world transformed before them. The planets were no longer wandering lights in the sky, but obedient bodies moving under calculable forces. The tides could be explained, the paths of projectiles predicted, the structure of the universe mapped with certainty. Newton had done what generations of philosophers had only dreamed. He had unveiled the hidden architecture of nature. This achievement brought him a fame he had never sought. The quiet, solitary scholar became a figure of almost mythical stature, his name spoken in the same breath as Galileo and Kepler, yet surpassing them in the scope of his synthesis. Honors and recognition flowed toward him, though they sat uneasily upon his reserved and inward nature. He remained wary of public attention, yet he could not escape it. He had become a pillar of European intellect, a man who had redefined the boundaries of knowledge. The triumph was not of wealth or conquest, but of pure reason, a victory of the mind over the chaos of the unknown. And though he carried his fame with characteristic detachment, the world around him had changed forever, revolving now, in part, around the force of his thought.
After the monumental success of the Principia, Newton's life entered a new phase, marked less by solitary intellectual labor and more by the machinery of public service and the weight of authority. The once reclusive scholar became drawn into the orbit of state power, not out of personal ambition, but from a sense of duty and perhaps a desire for stability after decades of inner turbulence. In 1696, he accepted the position of Warden of the Royal Mint, a post that placed him at the heart of England's financial system. It was a role far removed from the abstract realms of celestial mechanics, yet he approached it with the same methodical rigor that had defined his scientific work. The Mint at that time was beset by chaos. England's currency was riddled with clipped and debased coins, counterfeiters thrived in the shadows, and public confidence in the nation's money wavered. The economy staggered under the strain, and the government sought in Newton a figure of incorruptible intellect and resolve who might restore order. He immersed himself in the complexities of coinage with characteristic intensity. He studied the metallurgy of coins, the mechanics of their production, and the networks of criminal enterprise that undermined them. He worked long hours in his office at the Tower of London, scrutinizing records, devising new procedures, and reorganizing the staff. He treated the Mint not as an administrative post, but as a system to be understood and rebuilt from first principles. One of his greatest tasks was the Great Recoinage, a massive effort to replace the debased silver currency with new, accurately minted coins. It was a logistical undertaking on a scale few could manage, requiring the collection, melting, reminting, and redistribution of millions of coins throughout the realm. Newton imposed order with relentless discipline, coordinating mints across the country, overseeing the transport of bullion, and instituting strict standards of weight and fineness. He enforced efficiency and honesty, dismissing negligent officials and punishing corruption without hesitation. Under his direction, the Mint became an engine of precision, and the recoinage was completed with remarkable success, restoring the integrity of English currency and stabilizing the financial system. Newton's work at the Mint was not purely administrative. It drew him into the darker side of law enforcement. Counterfeiting was treated as treason, and he pursued counterfeiters with an almost prosecutorial zeal. He personally gathered evidence, interviewed informants, and tracked the movements of notorious figures in London's criminal underworld. The most famous of these cases was his relentless pursuit of William Challoner, a skilled and audacious counterfeiter who had eluded justice for years. Newton built a meticulous case against him, uncovering forgeries, bribes, and conspiracies, and presented the evidence so thoroughly that Challoner was convicted and hanged at Tyburn. This episode revealed a side of Newton few had seen before, a man of iron will who could descend from the heights of theory into the grit of the streets when the defense of order demanded it. In 1699, his efforts were rewarded with promotion to Master of the Mint, giving him full control over the institution. It was a position of great influence and income, and it solidified his place within the machinery of the British state. He became a figure not only of intellect but of power, consulted by ministers on economic policy, and trusted as a guardian of national stability. The mint under his command became a model of efficiency and security, and its coins carried the quiet imprint of his authority across the empire. In the eyes of the public, Newton ceased to be merely a man of science. He became an emblem of the rational order upon which the strength of the kingdom rested. His ascent continued beyond the walls of the Mint. In 1703, following the death of Robert Hooke, Newton was elected President of the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific institution in England. This new role crowned his reputation as the foremost authority in the realm of science. He presided over meetings, directed the Society's publications, and wielded considerable influence over the direction of British research. Under his leadership, the Society's prestige rose, and it became a cornerstone of the Enlightenment's intellectual network. Newton's presence lent it both gravitas and discipline. He encouraged experimental rigor, but could also be dominating, suppressing rivals and shaping debates to his own vision. By this time, Newton had become more than a scholar or administrator. He was an institution unto himself, a living symbol of the union between reason and authority. His opinions carried weight not only in scientific matters, but also in political and cultural spheres. He was knighted by Queen Anne in 1705, an honor that signified his complete transformation from obscure provincial student to national figure. Portraits of him began to circulate, showing not the solitary thinker bent over his books, but the dignified statesman draped in rich fabrics, embodying the might of an empire governed by intellect. Yet beneath the surface of his public grandeur, a subtle tension grew. The duties of administration left him little time for the deep, consuming investigations that had once defined his life. He managed vast responsibilities, corresponded with statesmen, and adjudicated disputes. Yet his mind often drifted back to the questions of his youth, the hidden forces, the nature of light, the ultimate structure of the cosmos. Drafts of unfinished manuscripts lay in his private chambers, filled with speculations he hesitated to publish, fearing controversy or misinterpretation. He had become a custodian of order, yet the restless curiosity that had driven him was not extinguished, only buried beneath layers of duty. In this phase of his life, Newton embodied the paradox of power. He had achieved control over institutions and commanded the respect of nations, yet he was increasingly distant from the solitary passion that had once animated him. He stood as the keeper of the empire, the mind that had mastered the heavens, now safeguarding the coins and counsels of the realm. The world saw him as a monument of rational authority, but within him lingered the quiet memory of the scholar who had once sought truth in the silent light of his chamber, far from the noise of power. As the years passed, Newton grew increasingly withdrawn and cautious, as though the fierce light of his youthful intellect had dimmed into a colder, more guarded glow. The vigor that had once driven him to scale the heights of thought gave way to a deep concern for the legacy he would leave behind. He became preoccupied with his reputation, guarding it as jealously as he once pursued the hidden laws of nature. He scrutinized how others spoke of his work, responded sharply to any perceived slights, and seemed haunted by the idea that new generations of scholars might eclipse his achievements. The image of posterity loomed over him like an invisible tribunal, and he sought to shape its judgment with meticulous care. Controversies that might once have sparked intellectual excitement now stirred only anxiety and resentment. He revisited old disputes, rehearsing the arguments and collecting evidence to defend his claims. The old quarrel with Leibniz over the invention of calculus consumed him in particular. Newton had long believed himself the true originator of the method, and he worked relentlessly to ensure that history would affirm his primacy. As president of the Royal Society, he orchestrated inquiries, gathered testimonies, and influenced the official report that favored his case. Yet even victory brought him little satisfaction. The defense of his name became less an assertion of pride than a shield against the creeping fear of obsolescence. In these later years, Newton turned much of his attention away from public science and immersed himself in private realms of thought that few around him understood. Theology and alchemy occupied him more than the mechanics of the physical world. He filled thousands of pages with speculations on biblical chronology, prophecies, and the hidden architecture of the divine plan. He studied ancient scriptures with the same relentless exactitude he had once brought to prisms and planetary orbits, searching for the original truths he believed had been obscured by centuries of corruption and superstition. He wrote on the dimensions of Solomon's temple, on the nature of the Trinity, and on the coming apocalypse, convinced that sacred knowledge lay encrypted in the remnants of antiquity. Alchemy, too, held him in its quiet grip. He collected obscure manuscripts, experimented with crucibles and furnaces, and sought the elusive philosopher's stone, which he believed was not merely a substance, but a key to understanding the unity of nature. He rarely spoke of these pursuits, fearing ridicule from the rationalists who now dominated European thought. The papers he left behind would astonish later generations by their sheer volume and fervor, revealing a man who never ceased to search for hidden patterns, even when he had long ceased to share them with the world. They were the private labyrinths of a mind that could not stop unraveling mysteries, even as its owner grew weary of the world's gaze. His health, once resilient despite the strains of relentless work, began to falter. Age brought him bouts of gout and painful stones, which forced him to rest for days at a time. He endured these ailments with stoic composure, yet they seemed to deepen his isolation. The robust figure who had once stalked the halls of Cambridge and the Mint now moved more slowly, his body bowed by the years, though his mind still burned with restless thought. Despite his infirmities, he remained a celebrated figure, honored by kings, courted by ambassadors, and revered by scholars across Europe. Letters arrived daily from distant cities seeking his opinion or blessing, as if contact with his name might confer some spark of his greatness. His home in London became a quiet stage where the theater of his fame played out. Distinguished visitors, scientists, philosophers, and politicians came to sit with him, hoping to glimpse the legendary intellect behind the lined and solemn face. They found a man courteous yet distant, speaking rarely and weighing every word, his conversation measured like the ticking of a clock. The house was filled with an atmosphere of restrained grandeur. The shelves lined with books and instruments, the air scented with paper and wax, the silence broken only by the scratch of his quill or the chiming of the hour. To those who visited, Newton seemed less a man than a monument, a living relic of an age when reason had reshaped the world. Yet beneath the marble stillness, there lingered the fatigue of a man who had spent a lifetime in ceaseless struggle, for truth, for recognition, for control over the chaotic forces of both nature and human judgment. The aura of majesty that surrounded him concealed a deep weariness. He had won all that the world could give, wealth, honors, titles, and undying fame, yet he seemed untouched by joy. The spark of youthful wonder that had once lit his path was now a faint ember, buried under the ashes of duty and suspicion. He appeared to stand alone at the summit of human intellect, but it was a cold summit, swept by the winds of solitude. As the sun of his life sank lower, Newton's days became marked by quiet routines. He read, he annotated ancient texts, he occasionally attended the Royal Society to preside with solemn dignity, and he received his visitors with formal grace. But his gaze often drifted inward, away from the conversations around him, as though he were already receding into the shadows of memory. Those who left his house carried the impression not of a man engaged with the present, but of a figure slowly withdrawing into the silence of history. In the stillness of his declining years, Newton stood like a fading constellation, its light still brilliant in the night sky, yet already traveling from a star long burning out, its fire spent in the pursuit of eternity. As the sun of his life sank lower, Newton's days became marked by quiet routines. He read, he annotated ancient texts, he occasionally attended the Royal Society to preside with solemn dignity, and he received his visitors with formal grace. But his gaze often drifted inward, away from the conversations around him, as though he were already receding into the shadows of memory. Those who left his house carried the impression not of a man engaged with the present, but of a figure slowly withdrawing into the silence of history. In the stillness of his declining years, Newton stood like a fading constellation, its light still brilliant in the night sky, yet already traveling from a star long burning out, its fire spent in the pursuit of eternity.
Isaac Newton died in March 1727, closing a life that had stretched across one of the most transformative centuries in human thought. His passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of his transformation from living figure to timeless symbol. He left behind not only books and manuscripts, but an intellectual architecture that reshaped how humanity understood the universe. The laws of motion he had formulated and the universal law of gravitation he had unveiled became the pillars upon which classical physics was built. They provided a framework that bound together the motion of falling apples and orbiting planets, unifying the heavens and the earth under the same rational order. This vision of a universe governed by knowable laws stood as one of the greatest achievements of the human mind, and it defined the path of science for centuries to come. In the decades after his death, Newton's work became the foundation of education for generations of scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. His Principia was treated almost as scripture within the intellectual world, studied line by line in the great universities of Europe. The clarity and rigor of his mathematics inspired new approaches to problem solving, while his demonstration that natural phenomena could be explained through universal laws emboldened others to search for order in fields far beyond mechanics and astronomy. The Enlightenment found in Newton its emblem of reason triumphant over superstition, and his image appeared in lectures, essays, and portraits as the archetype of the rational mind. Philosophers hailed him as the man who had deciphered the clockwork of creation, and statesmen invoked his name as proof that the human intellect could master nature and bend it toward progress. The reach of his influence extended far beyond the immediate confines of science. Newton's vision of a world governed by immutable principles shaped the emerging industrial age, which relied on the application of physical laws to engineering and technology. The machines, engines, and bridges of the 18th and 19th centuries bore the imprint of his mechanics. His work also influenced economic theory, architecture, and even political thought, as thinkers drew analogies between the balance of celestial forces and the balance of human institutions. He became a touchstone for the idea that society, like the cosmos, could be rationally ordered if only its laws were understood. Yet the legacy of Newton was not without paradox. He had been a solitary and secretive man, often suspicious and withdrawn. But after death, he was cast as a heroic figure of pure reason. The world that celebrated him knew little of his hidden obsessions with theology and alchemy, or the long years he spent deciphering biblical prophecies and searching for the philosopher's stone. Those manuscripts lay unseen for generations, locked away as curiosities, while the public image of Newton hardened into that of the cold, flawless intellect. This selective memory amplified his myth while concealing the depth and complexity of his inner life. The real Newton had been driven not only by logic, but by a yearning to uncover the ultimate harmony behind all things, a yearning that blurred the line between science and mysticism. Despite these contradictions, his reputation only grew with time.
He was buried with full honors in Westminster Abbey, an extraordinary tribute for a man of science in an age that had only just begun to value the power of the intellect as equal to that of kings and warriors. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage for scholars and admirers who saw in him the embodiment of human potential. Monuments rose in his name, and his likeness appeared in statues and paintings across Europe, each one presenting him as a modern sage whose mind had spanned the cosmos. The reverence surrounding him was not mere idolatry. It reflected the genuine recognition that his work had shifted the axis of human understanding. As centuries passed, the world moved beyond the physics he had built, but it never left him behind. Einstein, when proposing the theories that would supplant Newtonian mechanics, famously acknowledged that he had stood on Newton's shoulders. Even as relativity and quantum theory revealed deeper layers of reality, they did so in dialogue with the structure Newton had first constructed. His work became less a set of final truths than a starting point, a demonstration of what disciplined thought could accomplish. Every breakthrough that transcended his system testified to the path he had opened, the idea that nature could be known, measured, and explained through the tools of reason. Newton's legacy endured not only in formulas and theories, but in the cultural belief that the mysteries of the universe yield to patient inquiry. He had shown that even the most profound questions could be approached with the same rigor as the simplest mechanical problem, and that understanding was within reach of human minds willing to labor and endure. This conviction became a cornerstone of modern science and education, inspiring countless men and women to pursue knowledge with the same relentless determination. He proved that one mind, armed only with curiosity and discipline, could redraw the boundaries of the known world. In the long arc of history, Newton came to represent the triumph and the burden of genius. He illuminated the universe, and in doing so revealed the solitude of those who walk far ahead of their time. His life became a parable of human aspiration, the ascent from obscurity to immortality paid for with the weight of isolation and unceasing toil. His shadow stretched across the centuries as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that the pursuit of truth can lift humanity toward the stars, yet often at the cost of the one who bears the flame. Even as the world moved on, the figure of Newton remained, serene and monumental, a silent witness to the power of the human mind to pierce the darkness and leave behind a light that no passing age could extinguish.